Dr. Mirian Vilela. She's an Executive Director at Earth Charter Center at University for Peace in Costa Rica. Our second panelist is Professor Heila Lotz-Sisitka. She is at Rhodes University in South Africa. And Dr. Lutz Möller, Deputy Secretary General at German UNESCO Commission. This panel is facilitated by Professor Daniel Fischer, who is a UNESCO Chair holder at Leuphana University. And over to you, Daniel. That was a quick round because we don't want to waste time in reading bio notes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Deepika, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone also from my side. A warm welcome to our webinar on the revised UNESCO recommendation on education for peace, human rights, international understanding, cooperation, fundamental freedoms, global citizenship, and sustainable development. Very long name. We will unpack this in the webinar. Yeah, we are honored to have with us today 3 distinguished panelists who have all contributed or been involved in the drafting process of this significant document. So thank you for being with us today. We will take about 45 minutes to discuss with our panelists about the recommendation, and we will then also open it up to you. So if you have questions, please let us know by posting them on the Q&A board. So I would like to maybe as a first round take a closer look at this recommendation that we're discussing today, which is a revision of a document that dates back to the year 1974. And maybe a good starting point to bring us all on the same page is to start with the type of document that we are dealing with. There are many statements, calls to actions, proposals, and more out there in the world. But the old recommendation from '74 was quite a special document, also from a legal perspective. And Lutz, may I invite you to maybe explain to us what type of a document a recommendation is and why the old recommendation from '74 was such an important step forward back then?
Well, thanks a lot. I'll try to be very brief. So you have to understand that this idea of UNESCO didn't start in 1974. Immediately after UNESCO was founded in the 40s, it was already, they had the idea of having a convention, the most binding form of international law on education, on international understanding. That didn't work out in the Cold War. And in the late 60s, they came to a conclusion that they should have a text of international law, which is of a medium level bindingness for the member states. And I will say a few words in what this exactly implies. And then this was adopted in 1974. And now UNESCO came back to say, well, this text has aged a bit. I think we will speak more about that. But we need to refresh it, update it, bring it up to the challenges of today. And that's why we revised it over the last 2 years. A recommendation basically is an international law, and that means every single word, every single sentence of that law is negotiated by all member states of the United Nations. So every one of 94 member states of UNESCO had to agree to every single word of the text, and therefore we negotiated that over basically 2 full weeks. So that is something completely different from a text which some experts, some academicians draw up in a small group. This is law, and the bindingness that is not very strong formally, because it just implies that the member states of UNESCO have to report every 4 years to UNESCO what they have done in implementing that, and that is also actually the basis for monitoring SDG 4.7. But such a bindingness can become much more important over the upcoming years. So what is not so binding formally can develop a huge impact, and that depends on the commitment of all of the partners. And that means everybody who's here in this room today, if you apply meaning to this text, then it will become meaningful. So it's upon all of us to make this into something really important. It is already important, but we have to go a longer way. It doesn't stop yet.
Thank you, Lutz. Yeah, maybe we don't want to spend too much time on the old recommendation, but it was quite a seminal step, and we are building on this with the new recommendation. So, Heila, I would invite you to maybe share a bit your view on what made this old recommendation so significant, this document.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think, when we were given the task to work on the revision of this document, it was very interesting actually to see the farsightedness, if you want to call it that, in the 1970s, where, there was a lot of commitment to human rights education, and then also education for peace, international understanding, and so on. And when we came to revise the recommendation, which, by the way, it says you can call the recommendation on education for peace, human rights, and sustainable development. What was very interesting is that, of course, the conditions have changed so much since 1974. So we've had the, much better understanding of issues such as climate change, the need for global sustainable development, the need for, a different way of thinking about peace. So it's not just about, reducing war, it's actually about peace building. So a lot of different shifts in thinking over these last 50 years, because of course it is 50 years now. And so it was very interesting to be able to, see both the past, but also to kind of feel the present, if you like, and then also think into the future, what this document must do. Because if it's going to hold itself for the next 50 years, it needs to be quite visionary as well. And it needs to provide very good leadership to shift educational thinking around the world. So in short, I think that's what the process kind of unfolded in terms of what we are now looking at here in this recommendation.
Thank you, Heila, for sharing some of this context and background. Maybe as a last kind of reflection on the old recommendation before we move really to the content and the changes and the updates of the new one, I would like to ask you, Mirian, when we look back at the 74 recommendations and hear what Heila had to say about them back then, these issues still, you could say, seem timely and important today. We still have international conflicts, human rights issues, environmental degradation. So what is your perspective? Why was this updating needed in the first place?
Thank you, Daniel. I'm happy to be here and want to say that I 2 years ago, exactly today, was the first time I heard about the recommendation, to tell you the truth. And I think it's important to mention this because I work with the Earthchild International, have been working with sustainability, but inside the University for Peace. So when I heard about the 1974 recommendation, I went around the corridors of my office and asked experts who have been working with peace for years, and nobody had heard about this, imagine. So for me, it was the first eye-opening, because the reality is that there are so many instruments and policies and agendas, and sometimes it's difficult to keep a track. But I think the significance is that it has a special place in the UNESCO apparatus and how UNESCO works with the governments, and the government's commitment to report to UNESCO through these 1974 recommendations. So for me, the significance is that there is already an existing mechanism for countries to report to UNESCO through that existing mechanism. And I think the significance also in terms of change in time is that when it was put together around 74, the role of non-state actors was there, but not so clearly stated. And over the last 40 years or so, we have expanded our views on who are these non-state actors, what's the role they have, and what the role they are playing already, whether they know or not of the existence of a 1974 recommendation. There were a lot of schools, universities, museums playing a role in expanding awareness on issues around human rights and peace, and etc. So I think the new recommendation also, I think two things. Well, one, it makes more explicit the role of different non-state actors in contributing to this process, with the realization or the fact that governments cannot really implement the whole thing alone. There is a significant need here of a multi-stakeholder sort of process. So this new recommendation makes it more explicit. I think that's one thing. And the other thing in terms of the process between 74 and now is that over the past 40 years, new approaches also emerged, from climate change to sustainable development, global citizenship education, that were not there so explicit in 1974. So just the last point that I would like to make is that I think the beauty of this process is that it brings it all together under one umbrella. And I think one of the big challenges is that these different education agendas have been generated in different UN forums. Therefore, they stay as islands inside different UN forums, such as the climate change world and the global citizenship world, the global citizenship education world, and we generate different areas of thoughts and knowledge, and they are isolated. So I see them as islands of thoughts and movements that absolutely need bridges. We need to make bridges between the world of experts and efforts and movements and even policies on global citizenship education and sustainability and peace. So I think the beauty and the significance of this process now is that it's really making a strong effort to bring all of these under one umbrella, which, by the way, when the SDGs were launched in 2015, was also the first time the UN was bringing under the same umbrella the peace agenda with the sustainable development agenda. So I think it was one of the major breakthroughs of the SDGs. And I think, again, this new version of the 1974 recommendation is offering us is a way to look at it from a holistic approach and use this instrument as an existing mechanism inside the governments to report to UNESCO, but not limited to governments, but looking at a more collaborative manner to approach it.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. That's some really good reflections, and I think that was really helpful to maybe also better understand the context and background that this new recommendation comes from. But let's look more closely now at what the new recommendation is actually saying. When you read it, and we can post the links to the chat for all participants. So when you read it, you will see that it has a very all-encompassing scope. It says that it applies to all people, all contexts of educations, all levels. It also outlines a number of principles and calls out very specific action areas. And Heila, I'm interested in your view, from your longstanding involvement in the field, what you would say are the most important updates compared to the old version and what you see as the kind of main key messages of this new recommendation.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. I think as Miriam was saying, it brings many things together. If you look at the appendix, you'll see the large number of institutional documents and policies and instruments that have been developed over this time. And it brings all of these together. And it brings them together in a very focused way and also in an applied way. So our intention was to not just, produce more rhetoric, but to actually make very practical recommendations around key areas of education, such as learning and teaching materials, curriculum, higher education, and so on. So that's the one thing that I think is very strong in this document. The second thing that I think is very strong is that it actually pulls together a concept of transformative education. And I think that that is very important because, as Miriam was saying, you have peace education, you have citizenship education, you have ESD, you have many other things, and they are all transformative and intending to support transformative education. But I think for the first time, we actually have a very clear message of, the fullness, if I could call it that, the fullness of what a transformative education should be and should look like, all the way through to assessment. It makes the important point about assessment being empowering and being enabling, and that it's quite progressive concept of assessment. And I think that that's one area that all of our governments could actually look at. It also talks about transdisciplinarity in higher education. So it actually brings many quite progressive concepts into focus. There's also a section or a commitment to comprehensive sexuality education and trying to empower young people to be able to build strong and careful relationships. And of course, these things are very important in societies where we have high levels of gender-based violence and HIV/AIDS and so on. So I think that there's a lot of very strong content here that can really guide what the meaning of transformative education is and can be and should be. So in that, I think that's its visionary contribution. And of course, the sustainable development content was not there before. A climate change type of content was not there before. I've already mentioned the orientation to peace, which is different to the one that was there before, and so on, you know. So yeah, in brief.
Thank you very much, Heila. Yeah, you mentioned also a couple of seemingly maybe more controversial topics that have been included in the document, and I can imagine that updating such a document with such importance for the future design of education invites many different perspectives and requests and ideas. And I know, Lutz, you were very intensively involved in these negotiations. So I'm wondering were there any points of contestation in the negotiations surrounding this new recommendation?
Well, obviously they are, because as I said, this is the document of international law. This is what was negotiated word by word. And we have, of course, in this increasingly polarized world where we have an increasing number of countries which are governed by authoritarian, illiberal countries, we have very different views from those of liberal and democratic countries. So it is surprising the extent to what we before I look at the divergence, I have to focus again what is surprisingly all in that. And I fully agree with Heila and Mirian. What is really important that this brings all different ideas: peace education, human rights education, ESD, water education, brings it all together under one umbrella. That's very important. Transformative education, it's another very crucial important point. But what is also important, that this recommendation speaks very clearly about empowerment of learners, about the freedom of learners. Transformation is really spelled out in a way that we have to empower the individual learner. This is about knowledge, values, attitudes, behavior of the individual in a community, of course, but this is an important empowerment instrument for the individual learner at the same time. And what does it mean? We have in one of the main articles of this recommendation a long list of 12 skills or competencies, what you might call 21st century skills, which are you have found similarly in other documents before. The OECD has a document like that, the World Economic Forum has something like that, but nothing which has been agreed by governments. This is for the first time that we have a list of ESD skills, or you can call it 21st century skills, that everybody has agreed to. That's what learners should do. And it's exactly those skills that we need for the future of our humanity. So we have a long list of things that are really, there was a lot of consensus, and at the same time, a very, very modern language, like climate justice, climate crisis, planetary boundaries. I don't know of any text of international law where we have the terminology of planetary boundaries so far. We have it for the first time in this document, the only document, really the only intergovernmental global document for the content of education. Now, a few words on contestation. Certainly, you have already mentioned it, Heila. Comprehensive sexuality education, you mentioned that was a major topic of contestation, specifically with countries, with governments who domestically have a rather conservative set of values, of family values that they propagate internally. And for the entire idea of mentioning gender or sexuality in such a document is considered as a stumbling block as well. So therefore, for example, the government of Iran has chosen at the very end at the General Conference of UNESCO to give a note of declaration that they do not necessarily regard all of the contents of this recommendation as necessarily bindingly for them at the domestic level. So yes, there have been a few issues which were contested, but what I think is much more important is the wide degree of consensus that was in the room. I think, for my personal opinion, it is much more important that we saw so much that brings us together and where we found surprisingly broad consensus.
Thank you, Lutz, for this answer and these reflections. Mirian, you are, as a representative of also Earth Charter, also kind of provide this civil society perspective. So from that perspective, I would also be curious about your maybe experience of this process, or what stands out to you as from a civil society perspective about this new recommendation.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, I think the process was quite rich. It took place, I think, throughout the year of 2022, mainly, and of course, half of 2023. For me, what was interesting, I was invited to help prepare a technical note on the role of non-state actors, which I did in collaboration with a friend of mine, a colleague. But to prepare the technical note, we had to do a lot of research about what was going on in terms of not only the governments doing in terms of implementation and reporting the 1974 recommendation, but also the role of non-state actors. As I mentioned before, it was interesting to see that many non-state actors, so museums, for instance, there is a beautiful museum in Mexico that is doing a lot on informal education, on tolerance. There is a city government of São Paulo, Umapaz, that is doing a lot on environment education and peace education for years, for 2 decades or so. And there are many organizations in worldviews. For instance, there is a whole movement in actually private schools also in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, doing a lot in terms of education on human rights, peace education, and even ESD, without necessarily knowing that it is in contribution to this recommendation. So, but it's valuable work that needs to be made visible, no, and needs somehow. So I think the beauty here in this new process is that somehow governments need to orchestrate platforms and processes to bring in not only what governments are doing in terms of the implementation of these, but also what other stakeholders are doing to implement this process in a more consistent way, to give visibility, to monitor, to report what's being done, not only through the lenses of governments. So I saw these happening, these interests, and on the different views through the process of revision, especially during the year of 2022. There were, I think, 3 technical notes that were prepared to contribute to this process. I was involved only in one, which is the contribution of non-state actors. But there were a number of regional consultations. I remember engaging in Latin America and in the Caribbean, 2 different regional consultations here, mainly led by governments, but also involving non-state actors in talking about each language and recommendations of what should be included here. So I think the process itself is very valuable, but it's also an illustration of what needs to take place now when time comes to the implementation of this. And just to end here, I was very happy to see also strong language on the issue of an ethic of care. So, for instance, there's a place in the draft or in the recommendation, the new version of the recommendation, that emphasizes the importance to promote an ethic of care and solidarity. Similar language can be found also in the Futures of Education report, for instance, right? Similar language, and similar language actually can be found in the SDG 2030 framework, or the ESD 2030 framework. The difference here, I think, is that this is one instrument that governments have, because of its legal status inside the UNESCO process, makes governments more committed to undertake this process of monitoring and reporting. It gives a mechanism to make that happen. So I think this new recommendation certainly addresses the challenge of the SDG 4.7 in as an indicators that are there, how to monitor and report that through inside the government systems. So anyway, I think a number of several keywords and languages in terms of skills and guiding principles that we find in this important recommendation, we can also find in other UNESCO documents. However, the process of making it during the year 2022 and 2023 was very broad and very participatory, not only engaging governments and experts, but also civil society organizations, bringing in, I think, different issues depending on the context in reaching this recommendation. Again, I was particularly happy to see the importance of cultivating not only an ethic of care, but also an ethic of global citizenship and shared responsibility for peace. So this language is there, and now the question is how governments and non-state actors can raise awareness about this instrument and infuse that into education, so that when time comes for reporting on this, governments can see, okay, what was done in the education systems to cultivate an ethic of care or an ethic of global citizenship. Again, when I come across these various important UNESCO and UN documents, often it comes to my mind what the teacher in the primary, secondary school do with this. How can they make it happen in the classroom? So I think that's where we are now in the process of digesting and make it easier for different actors to make use of it and align what happens really in the classroom with these sort of instruments.
Thank you, Miriam. This is also a question that we will address in a few minutes as we move closer to implementation and impact of this recommendation. Maybe one last question about more the content-related aspects. We've heard that it was a participatory process, that many stakeholders were involved. Lutz mentioned that it has been fairly consensual with fewer points of contestation than maybe expected. So I would be curious in your views, if you also see, next to all these achievements and the progress, the progressive kind of ideas, if you also see some shortfalls or missed opportunities, where there are issues that you have wanted to see addressed in the recommendation that did not make it to the final text. And please feel free to come in, any of you who has a reflection on that.
Maybe I start and be but very short. Something that Heila and Miriam have said before already is something that I want to emphasize, and that's something that Germany had very successfully argued in our intervention, was to establish education as a multi-stakeholder endeavors where we bring on also non-state actors. So this is a thing which in democratic countries, mostly where you have a role for teachers and students themselves in the education process, is not something really new, but in rather more authoritarian countries to foster education as a multi-stakeholder exercise is of crucial importance. Therefore, we were very happy to see that. What we didn't achieve actually was something which, looking back at the entire process, was maybe completely unrealistic, because we always had imagined that it should be a much shorter text, that it should be maybe less repetitive, etc. But I have to be honest as well, also the German contributions to the negotiations, we didn't make it shorter either. In the end, we added text, we added terminology which was important to us, like referencing the Berlin Declaration on Education for Sustainable Development, and adding a reference to what we have to understand under inclusive education. So we added some additions as well. So other countries did so, and everybody wanted to have it shorter, but we couldn't really agree on that, because that would have required somebody really to let go of important content. And as you say, there is so much important content in it. So what would you cut out?
Thank you, Lutz. I saw Heila also unmuted.
Yeah, so I think actually it is quite a lot shorter than it originally was. It's been, I was quite impressed with the way in which this process was set up and managed, the extensive consultation, the careful listening to everybody. And I think the UNESCO directorate that was doing this work were just outstanding. And to manage that, ongoing levels of integration of new content, new perspectives, but not let it get longer and longer. It's an absolute art. So I think all things considered, if you think about the scope of the consultation in this document, 3,000 people to start with, and then a kind of a reworking of it, and then going through the whole intergovernmental process. So an enormous process, and to come out of all of that with 19 pages on such an important topic to the world today, I thought actually was, quite an achievement. But yeah, interesting the process of negotiating. But I was also, as you said earlier, really impressed with the way in which the core was maintained, the core message, the core direction, and it doesn't have internal contradictions. It's actually a document that is free from internal contradictions, which is amazing, because most often you get these kinds of things that got internal contradictions, but this one doesn't have. It actually carries one clear message all the way through. So, I think all those things considered, I think it's actually, we as a societies, I think around the world, we probably will be appreciating this. And I think the challenge now, of course, is to make it's more available to everybody, and to understand what it is, because even for me, as Mirian was saying, it took me a while to understand what this is, what is its significance. And having seen the difficulty that, for example, many governments have to report on ESD, for example, it just gets sort of left out because there's no proper instrument for them to report on, and therefore it just gets left out of their budgets and all other things. So it is actually very important to have these types of instruments that actually force our governments and our partners, because as we've seen in this document, it's really a multi-stakeholder orientation, that everybody has got something common to work towards. I think for me, that is also very important. Yeah. So, yeah.
Just add one sentence, because you rightfully thanked the UNESCO Secretariat for its amazing work. And since I see that Lydia is in the audience and she's actually listening to the discussion, great. Once more, thank you, Lydia, and your entire team for doing an amazing work.
Thank you. Mirian, I do also have another question to you. Maybe you can answer the same question in responding to my next question, because indeed we've been talking so much about how to put it into action. And when I told my students, for example, about the new recommendation, I sensed some hesitation in the room, with maybe some students thinking, as a teacher in primary school in my country, working for an NGO, as a community-based organization, working in adult learning, in what ways can I expect to see this new recommendation have a real impact on my work? And maybe to take up Lydia's questions, what can we do to translate this into action? So this is, I think, the elephant in the room question, and maybe you can give a first stab at that, Miriam.
Yeah. Well, I want also to join in honoring the process of making it happen, the revision process in a participatory manner. I know many people at UNESCO, not only the UNESCO headquarters, but also the different UNESCO regional offices and governments got engaged in this rich process. And again, in your previous question, I think the beauty is that if you are when you are involved in a specific field, you are married with it, right? So if you have been involved with peace education, you think peace education is the most important thing in the world. And if you are involved with ESD or environment education, the same. So you attach, because your research, 30 years, 40 years, working in the field of environment education or global citizenship education or human rights, and you always want to put yours on the top as the one that is more important than the others. So I think, again, the beauty of this new instrument is sort of try to bring these different islands of thoughts and realms of movements together, condensed, and I think this is one of the biggest values, because again, if you go to a school or to a classroom and you say, no, let's work with human rights education, and this is the most important, then following months you come and say, no, forget about that, is education for sustainability is the most important thing. And so there is a sort of attention on how to draw attention on what is the most important thing to teach. And the fact is they have to teach mathematics and etc. So I think we need to look at the challenge that was achieved and celebrate the fact that it's really bringing this all together. Now, I think to make it relevant, what next? When I have been around NGOs and the work of people like me, we all think this is easy. And that is the most important thing, and that's it. When I go and talk with governments and policymakers at the governmental level, especially in Central America, in Latin America, this is not the most important. The most important is to ensure kids don't drop school in secondary education, because it's a huge drop of secondary education school. They're talking about quality education, ensuring quality education. So for me, the biggest thing and the challenge is for us to take this new instrument that is relevant, that is important, that is just out of the oven, let's say, and make it relevant to quality education at the government level, but also at the school level, because not all schools have time, or even schools or universities, to look into all these so many different instruments that are generated, right? But many are looking at how to improve the quality of education. Many are looking at how to increase the national budgets into formal education, or the non-state actors are looking at also how to contribute to education for change. So I envision it will be more helpful if we can make this instrument relevant to also those who are looking at relevant, like how this recommendation can also contribute to quality education and to the well-being of society, not as something apart, not as something that is luxury. So I think it's a communication challenge that we all have, to make it easy for people to connect to their contexts and not as something apart.
Thank you, Miriam. I would like also to pass this question on to Heila. What can we do to make it, to fill it with life, basically, this recommendation?
I think the recommendation has got many invitations actually for all educators to, you know, look at it and think, okay, so it invites contextualizing of education in the curriculum recommendations. It actually suggests that education should be more contextual, that education should work more with learners' languages, indigenous languages. You know, so it actually is inviting of contextualizing of these transformative areas of education. So the way that I would use it, and in fact, I think, is to use it as an invitation, you know, for people to come into this recommendation and see what invitation exists there for transforming education or for improving education, improving the quality of education. And I totally agree with Miriam that it should very much be connected to the concept of quality education, because in fact, this is what we should be meaning when we talk about education quality. We can't be working with a concept of educational quality that is sort of, you know, lost in the 1900s, which in some cases we still have, you know. So I think it's an invitation, and if we can use it as such, and I'm sure that you know, Lydia and the UNESCO team, I know that they did have plans to also support, you know, co-engaged response to this document. And the more we can make it invitational to teachers, you know, any teacher could read this document and begin to see something that is exciting for them to think about doing. Your students, Daniel, if you gave it to them as an invitation, you know, what is invitational in here for them to think about how they can, you know, begin to work with these kinds of instruments at both the practical level, but also at the governmental level. So I think, you know, I guess it's a bit of a movement for educational change, which is also the intention of the Futures of Education report, that signaled very clearly that we are actually at a time in human history where we really need very rapidly to be establishing a new movement for educational transformation, because the current system is divisive. You know, it's leaving too many people excluded and alienated. So we must reframe education so that it doesn't alienate children, and that they can be successful. And that requires, you know, imagination. It requires more and different pedagogical imagination. It requires policy imagination. And it actually just requires us to have a different commitment to young people and the world that they are working their way into. Because, you know, they really have a challenge. You know, we've left them with a planet now that is under a lot of stress. You know, water systems are failing. The climate change issues are really extending. And we seem to really need to put much stronger measures in place to reimagine education in a different way for the future. So, you know, that's my feeling, is let's use it as an invitation at all levels and see where we get, you know. Yeah.
Thank you, Heila. I see there's also many questions and comments in the chat, which apologies at this point, we probably won't all be able to cover all, but I see many of the comments in the chat that I was skimming through. They address also national priorities, national challenges, national circumstances. There were issues of the role of women in certain countries and how that can be leveraged when you have governments in place that are not supportive of that. We have questions here about countries being in war, you know, and how that recommendation can play out here or contribute here. So maybe a question to you, Lutz, about how general or how specific this recommendation is and applies to different national or even cultural contexts.
Well, this is the interesting thing if you have a global a text of global international law, because it is already, through the entire process, it's already ensured that what you have in there can apply to as many countries as possible, and to some of countries which have maybe a bit more of an advanced education system, Some of the contents may be not completely surprising. To other countries, they may be very revolutionary and maybe not so easy to accommodate. But this is the unique thing about it, which we are not used to deal with at the level of the education community, that we can reference a text which is law. It's not just a declaration, or it's not just a conference proceedings. It's not just a handbook or a manual or blah, blah, blah. No, it's law. I mean, it's not very binding law, but this is a consensus. So you can go to another country and talk to these people there and say, your government has also agreed to that. Your government is part of this, and look at the context. We can use this text as a bridge where we nationals of two different countries, we can talk on the same footing about certain concepts and try to develop them further and try to adapt them to the specific needs, whether it's vocational training in a specific setting, working with women in another setting. But this is strong, and I think it will be very impactful if all of us here in this group, I see a number of names in the participants list that I know very well. A lot of them have a great multiplication role and can bring this message out to the world. This is, when it comes to the content of education, this is the once in a lifetime opportunity that we all have to work with this text, because the last text that we had is 50 years ago. The next one will maybe come on only in 30 or 40 or 50 years. So in our professional lifetime, we have to work, and we can work with an excellent text, and we can have impact. I will just give you a few things that happened in Germany after 1974. The UNESCO Associated Schools Network was completely restarted from scratch. That gave the enormous momentum that we had in Germany with our Associated Schools Network. We had in Parliament, in several different institutions, for the first time, the issue of human rights education. Our national parliament and the Minister of Education committed to human rights education. Amnesty produced the first human rights text in education text in Germany. We had the restart of the German-Polish Schoolbook Commission through this text. So a lot happened. We have forgotten about that. But the same thing we want to achieve for Germany in our case, and this should happen everywhere. And I'm very happy that very likely the ministers of education of Germany, of the 16 states, they will soon hopefully adopt a new recommendation on ESD. And we have already a reference to the text, to the UNESCO recommendation in this draft. I'm looking forward to that. But this is going to, let's use this momentum. This is a unique opportunity.
Thank you for these very encouraging words, Lutz. Yeah, I see the time is flying by, so I would definitely like to ask one more question to all of you before we maybe go back to the chat again, if we have time left. So this webinar is part of the Rethinking Higher Education series, and higher education is just one of the sectors mentioned in the recommendation. But what stood out to me was that the recommendation lists quite an extensive number of very specific actions to be taken at different levels of education to make sure that it gets implemented holistically. So my question regarding higher education is, what do you see as the most critical actions that the recommendation urges the higher education sector to undertake? Do you have some thoughts on that? Just come in, please.
I'll come in quickly. I think what I think is quite progressive is that it actually states that higher education, let me just find the little quote here, I'll read it, because I think it's so significant. It encourages higher education. Here we are. It says here, yes. So higher education, encouraging higher education institutions to ensure an inclusive learning environment to help create and disseminate scientific, technological, and innovative knowledge in education and in communities, and to co-create inter and transdisciplinary knowledge together with stakeholders and foster dialogue. Now that I know that there's a new movement in higher education to develop transdisciplinary practice, but I think this is also possibly the first time we've seen it in an international law document. So I think that is particularly interesting and important for higher education, because I think much transdisciplinary work has been done and it's being driven, by what we could call the innovative academic and the enthusiastic academic and so on. But it could be much more strongly institutionalized, especially the institutional architecture that one needs to support transdisciplinary research and practice, including in the funding streams for research in higher education. So I think that to me is one thing that stands out for the higher education, particularly higher education as such. But of course, the other things are also important, like open science policy, open educational resources, and so on. And of course, we have quite a challenge with the academic journal systems these days that are not actually as open as they purport to be. So it's a major challenge, actually, that the knowledge production system is becoming enclosed and privatized, even in the name of open access. It's unaffordable, actually, for many people around the world to pay those open access prices. So it's not really open science. So I think there's a need for, a lot more, political work coming through also for higher education around that particular point. So those are just two things, I think, Daniel.
Thank you, Heila. That's great. So going back to the documents, Mirian, Lutz, do you see any pressing kind of actions, call to actions for the higher education sector?
Yeah, what comes to my mind is the academic freedom in higher education, that not necessarily what this comes from the top is embraced easily. And the more years a professor is, the more sometimes stiff it is to embrace new things and idea and change curriculum. But certainly the recommendation stresses the importance that all learners come across or the principles and the themes in these recommendations. But for all learners to have the opportunity to have the knowledge and skills and values that are embedded here, we need to look at the professors, the teachers, and the curriculum of the higher education. And that's not really, I would say, very easy to do. But I think leadership in higher education, from the deans to the directors or presidents of higher education institutions, really need to orchestrate a participatory process, first to sensitize the different disciplines and academics. What does it mean, this recommendation to engineers, to law, to different fields? And we have a challenge. People don't have time to reflect or think or come. Everybody in academic field is really working in their silos. So, but I think with a good leadership, be it from the administrative side of the university, sometimes a dean, or I have seen that even students come with the leadership. When students really come and demand new approaches, demand the university, sometimes it goes even faster. And when the students sort of raise the flag and say, we need to change our curriculum and the ways and the approach, and needs to reflect more of these things in the business discipline or each of the disciplines in the university. So what I see is that we really need to look carefully on these guidelines or the actions that are okay. If all learners in higher education should have the opportunity to enhance their knowledge and skills on the issues that are inside this thing, we should look at the institutions and the teachers and the disciplines before the students, like how can we reflect that? So I think articulating participatory processes when a rector or president is not ready, that leadership can come from a student body, or that leadership comes from a specific professor. So I just want to encourage that the leadership can come from different angles of the higher education institution. So partnerships inside the institution with the different actors, I think it's crucial. Communication and partnership among them. Just one last point. I think we need also to look at opportunities. So for instance, if I look at the case of Costa Rica, when the SDGs were launched in 2015, 6 months later or a few months later, the president created a platform. So it was a leadership of the president, created a national platform for implementing the SDGs and invited the public universities to be part of that, to commit to implement the SDGs. So I see, rather than creating new platforms, I see that a good leadership would be, okay, here there is an important instrument, which is the revised 1974 recommendation, that we can embed in the existing mechanism of the countries, for instance, to implement the SDGs, because it reinforces existing processes rather than create a separate process. So that's, I think I would like to just highlight that. Let's look at the existing platforms and processes that are going on and see how this instrument can reinforce what is there. And I, just to close, I think UNESCO will have a very important role to play, of course, in raising awareness, in coordinating activities, and in the process of just communicating on how to make it happen in practice. And I just want to celebrate that. I think we have the institutions in place, we have the knowledge in place, and I think we just need good orchestration or coordination of the process.
Thank you, Mirian. Thank you. Time is almost up, so I would like to ask all of our three speakers for a final 3 words, 4 words maybe. So if we are all going back to our context, to our educational context, be it at universities, be it in schools, be it in policy institutions, what would be your main advice for us? With call to action, basically. How can we make use of this, best use of this opportunity? Mine one would be, please share about it. That's 4 words, but that would be my one. And I might start with Heila to just take your final thought.
I think, of course, the important area to work with is the policy system, because that's always, has such a big impact. I saw Lydia put a comment in there that some countries are using this now to do policy review, to check that their policies are aligned with, what is needed in the 21st century. So that would be an incredibly powerful process if we could get a national policy review tool developed from this recommendation. So that, I think, would be fantastic to follow through on. And then, the other point I made earlier is the invitational, to try to find the invitational spaces so that people can become part of something like this and not see it as a document just out there that belongs to somebody else or is a UNESCO document, but that it is something that belongs to all of us, because it's actually all of our futures. So it's that invitational space, and I'm wondering how we create that together, because that, of course, is important for building the social movement for change. So those 2 things, I think, are what I would say would be important to work on. So participatory, opening to the policy system. Thanks.
Thank you, Heila. Lutz, what's your final piece of advice? And very short, possible.
Very short. Make this, as Heila said, make this your own recommendation. Make this your text. Work with it. Tell others about it. Make this a reference. Become a multiplicator. And if you doubt that your government will take this serious, then write to your parliamentarian, write to your parliamentarian what they are planning, how they are going to, what they are going to do with it. Are they going to do some implementation work on that? Are they going to report in the next cycle 4 years from now to UNESCO? So take this on board. Don't underestimate what law can do.
Thank you, Lutz. And Miriam, one final reflection, very short.
Well, I would just acknowledge that all of us, we are educators in different fields, even with our families. We are learners and educators at the same time in the informal realm, and sometimes at non-formal education level and formal education, be it in higher education or K-12. So within our different contexts, there's much we can do. I think what we need just to build bridges among different knowledge, areas of knowledge in spheres of work, build bridges to enhance collaboration. I have experienced, or I have sensed that sometimes some groups are invisible in the process, but I think we are entering into a world that we need to do the best we can to give voice to those invisible but very rich experiences that are taking place, that are not necessarily in the government realm, are actually sometimes in the non-governmental sphere. But I would like just to close by saying that the whole process would be very much enhanced if we could give visibility to the work of various actors, government and non-state actors, in monitoring, evaluating, reporting every 4 years what's going on in terms of the implementation of this recommendation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. This has been an incredibly insightful discussion that I will not dare to summarize, but we will come up with a brief summary and reflection on our website. And I also invite you to join our newsletter, which will be redesigned and relaunched. There's a link in the chat. Thank you very much. Again, I wish to extend my gratitude to all of our 3 speakers. So please join me in giving them a hand. I would also like to extend my gratitude to all of you for your interest and for your very active participation. And I would also like to thank our UNESCO Chair team here at Leuphana, led by Deepika June, who has worked very hard to bring us together here and to make this event possible. So thank you to you too. Yeah, we're wishing you all well at the end of this webinar, with the hope that you have gained new insights, new momentum for the very important work you are all doing. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being engaged, and hope to reconnect soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.